In this module, we'll be covering how to render value schemes to depict three-dimensional space. As we covered in the last module, value is the lightness or darkness of an object or hue. It is light and value. Historically, artists used lights and darks or values to create the illusion of light and shadow in their work. Highlights appear where light hits an object. The area that turns away from the light source is the shadow area. By recreating these lights and darks with pencil, pen, or in our case paint, an artist mimics what happens in real life. This is called modeling of form. Modeling fools the eye into thinking that there are three dimensions rendered onto a painting surface or picture plane, which is only two dimensions. What does color add to a picture? How does it affect us? One way to find out is to drain all the color out of a painting. It's possible to understand what's going on, but much of the emotional context is missing. In this image by James W. Turner, we can make out a range of values from lightest to darkest, with the sunset being the lightest value on the page, and the dark waves crashing in the foreground. This painting does a good job of defining space through rendering a value. We have a good idea of distance and form, but what do we lose with the subtraction of color? Color may be one of the first things you notice in a painting, but hue is only one aspect of the composition. Many beginning artists mistake color choice as the root of success or failure in a painting. However, the viewer reads a painting through its values. Visual interest is created through contrast of values, and composition relies on how light and dark values are arranged. Color should only be considered as working within a value structure. Notice this image. This image is fully saturated and has a good use of a limited color palette. However, something feels off. When we remove the color, the composition seems bland and we lose some of the objects to the background. Understanding the inherent value of your hues, as well as having a working knowledge of tints and shades, will help you produce better paintings through use of value. When working monochromatically, shades create depth and shadow give objects their form. Tints are used in contrast to focus the viewer's attention on the figure. Darker values visually recede into the background, while tints appear to advance into the foreground. Most drawing tools, such as pencil or Conte, automatically make a monochromatic image. However, painters have historically rendered figures or scenes in grisaille, which literally means gray. Grisaille painting historically is most often used as a preliminary step to plan a tonal value scale. It's part of a process called underpainting. Laying down your values before your colors are overlaid in transparent glazes can create depth and luminosity in your work. Before we can execute any piece of artwork, even in grisaille, we must understand how value creates form. Understanding value is almost synonymous with understanding light and form, because one cannot exist without the other two. The combination of light and shadow creates a range of values, which then create the illusion of form. Because depicting value and form depends so much on light, we need to understand how light behaves when it illuminates form. The good news is that when light falls on a form, it acts in predictable ways. We can learn to predict the behavior of light by studying how light falls on basic forms. We will refer to this predictability as the anatomy of the shadow. By anatomy, we are referring to the order and arrangement of parts of a shadow. Much like how your head is always relative to your torso, and your torso is relative to your legs, parts of a shadow are always oriented in an ordered way. The anatomy of a shadow always includes an order from side facing the light to cast shadow, the highlight, the center light, the halftone, the terminator, the core of the shadow, reflected light, occlusion shadow, and cast shadow. The highlight is the lightest value of your object. This is where the light reflects the hardest. Sometimes it may be more diffuse depending on the gloss or shininess of your object. The center light is the second lightest value. This area always faces the light source. The halftone comes next. It's the gradual transition from the core of the shadow to the center light. Think of it as half in light and half in dark, hence halftone. The terminator is next. It's the edge along the form where light and shadow meet each other. If the light is strong, the terminator will end more abruptly. In softer light, the terminator is more diffuse. The core of the shadow is simply that, the darkest part of the shadow on the object. The reflected light always comes behind the core of the shadow. This is where light from the object's surrounding bounces back into the form. The occlusion shadow is the darkest part of the cast shadow. This shadow forms between the object blocking the light and the surface it is sitting on. Always make sure to include an occlusion shadow because it will make your object seem more grounded. Finally, we have cast shadow. The shadow is caused by the object blocking the light. Cast shadows follow the shape of the object and fade further from the occlusion shadow. Their length depends on where the source light is situated. Multiple projections will be cast if there's more than one light source. Learning to identify these parts of the shadow's anatomy and placing them in their proper relationship is one of the keys to achieve a look of dimensionality. Every object you paint will have to appear to be three-dimensional if it is to convince the viewer of an image spatial illusion. By careful observation and frequently looking at our subject, we will be able to quickly break down an image into its anatomical value structure. In this image, we have two light sources. So relative to the light source or sources, your object will still have the same anatomy. However, the size, number, and shape of these parts will change, but the order will stay the same. Shown in this image, the two light sources create two highlights and two cast shadows. With two light sources, the terminator and core of the shadow become softer and less distinct. The occlusion shadow becomes more pronounced as the two light sources create two smaller cast shadows. The cast shadows and the halftones also have less contrast and are a little lighter. Factors like this will vary depending on number and direction of light sources. The best tool used to combat this is close observation and understanding of the anatomy of the shadow. With other shapes, the anatomy may look a little different. However, the order of the anatomy will always remain the same. The highlight and center lights act differently depending on the shape. However, they're always in the same place. In the sphere, the highlight is more circular and contained than the cylinder or the cone. In all the shapes, the core of the shadow is the darkest part of the shadow and is always next to the middle tone in the light. However, the light acts differently depending on the shape. The sphere's highlight is more circular and contained than the cylinder or cones, which are more elongated and cast along their form. Highlights are always in the middle of the middle tones. Depending on the surface of an object, your highlight may or may not be as bright as you expect. On a duller surface, a highlight will be more diffuse than on a more reflective or shiny surface. No matter the shape of the object, the cast shadow always dissolves and becomes lighter as they travel away from the occlusion shadow. However, some will retain some aspect of the form blocking the light. For example, a cube will have a geometric shadow, whereas spheres will appear more rounded, and a cones will often have a point if the cast shadow is long enough. Cast shadows are always darkest when the object casting the shadow is nearby. The cast shadow determines where the object sits in space and how it is related to the other objects. We can tell how close objects are in relation to one another based on how diffuse the shadow is. A softer shadow will suggest the form is further away from a light source, and a stronger shadow will suggest closer proximity. When an object casts a shadow onto another, the intensity of the shadow will also determine how close the objects are to one another. Planar shapes will behave differently than the rounder geometric shapes we've covered earlier. Notice how the cube divides the same light, but it looks as if it is lit differently. The planes which make up its form cause the light and shadows to spread across the planar surfaces. Notice how the core of the shadow makes up one plane, the highlight another, and the midtone a third still. Most planar shapes will effectively have the same schematic no matter how complex, the light will behave the same way, just more fractured. The distance of the light source will determine the angle of the shadows cast from your objects. Keep this in mind when setting up your still life. Be sure to pay special attention to where your light source is. For example, the image to the left has the light source high and is a fair distance from the objects. However, the light source for the image on the right can be read as emanating from between the objects. The angle of the light will determine the length of a shadow as well. If an object is under a light source, the shadow will be small and concentrate under the object. However, if an object is lit from an angle, the shadow will be longer. A trick to quickly break something down into its value structure is the artist's squint. An artist's squint is not used to improve visual acuity, rather somewhat the opposite effect is the goal. Artists squint far more dramatically than one would when trying to focus. Artists squint to visually simplify the values in the scene, to eliminate the perception of reflected light, and to better see the whole. Your eyelids and lashes block some of the indirect light rays. Squinting reduces the composition to generalizations and basic shapes of form and value. This helps to quickly identify and represent value relationships. You can also simplify things further by grouping planes. For example, to simplify something as complex as the rocks along a shoreline, as seen in this painting by James Gurney, it helps you to organize groups of planes that are roughly parallel. The rocks seem to break along four definite fracture planes: top planes, side planes in lighter halftone, front planes in darker halftone, and then planes in shadow. Actual scenes such as this have a lot more complexity, detail, and randomness of tones. Grouping the planes makes it easier to sort things out. So regardless of the nuances and subtleties, always try to state the form in terms of the simplest truth, light and shadow. This makes the details read instantly and it saves painting time. Similarly, it is possible to translate these ideas to apply to complex organic forms. These are 3D models of the head created by John Asaro, and they help our overall understanding of how light is absorbed and reflected on surfaces of the head. By seeing the exaggerated planes and angles of an object that we often think of as round or spherical, can help us break down the form to more recognizable elements and help us group our shadows and planes to convey value. Can we always trust what we think we see? Here are 3 swatches labeled black, white, and black. Are these swatches labeled correctly? You would think not. The swatch on the left isn't black, it's mid-range gray, and so is the one on the right. The swatch in the middle isn't white, it's a darker value than the other two. As we've discussed previously, the value of a hue is measured in its lightness or darkness compared to the scale of grays in between pure white and pure black. Here the swatch labeled number 1 is black paint on the wall. Number 3 on the far right is a jet black dress shirt, and number 2 in the middle is a white newspaper. Even when the tones are adjacent, such as the 2 and 3, our minds tell us white is lighter. It's good to keep this rule in mind. In bright sunlight, a newspaper in shadow can be darker than a black shirt in the light. This phenomenon can be explained by Adelson's checker shadow illusion. These two checkerboards display how light and shadow can affect how we perceive value. In this illustration, it appears as though the black square A is darker than the white square B. However, they are the exact same value. Through context, our perception of value changes. Under normal circumstances, value consistency allows us to distinguish between brightly lit dark surfaces and dimly lit white surfaces. This helps us to detect edges and forms. In the general case, we believe we can determine value being independent of external conditions. However, like simultaneous contrast, it's all dependent on context. Here you can see me moving around A and B along the grid. No matter how many times I shift them, they are the exact same color. It's important to know that the value is relative but can also adhere to any number of scales. Value, if you're counting steps on a value scale from 1 to 10, you might typically see 5 steps of tone from sunlight to shadow. The separation would be reduced if there were high clouds, hazy atmosphere, or light-colored ground surface. In this painting, you may notice there is a limited number of values. However, the range in values goes from 8 to 1, with several stops within the mid-range. With as few as 5 value shifts, you can show depth within an image. However, it's important to know that often value schemes rarely tend to go completely black or completely white. Even the darkest part of this painting only hits about a 1 on the value scale, and the lightest hits about an 8. Nothing hits completely white or completely black. In art, depth refers to the perceived distance between the background and foreground of a composition. It is a way of manipulating space, which is a key element in art that refers to the distance around and between subjects and aspects of a composition. Techniques that create the illusion of depth on a flat surface help your image look more three-dimensional and lifelike. Artists can use varying tools of composition, implied lines, color, and value to create the illusion of space and give your paintings an added layer of realism. Foreground, middle ground, and background. Many new artists overlook the importance of creating space in a drawing or painting. The result usually looks flat, or objects can appear to be floating, so consider using foreground, middle ground, and background to create space. Think of these as layers in your painting. To show these layers, note the painting of 3 rows of cakes by Tybald. Foreground, which refers to the first layer here, are objects closest to the viewer. Middle ground is the middle layer and is often where the subject of a painting is assumed to be placed. Background is the layer of an image furthest from the viewer. Background is great for providing setting or context to your painting. Overlap. Overlap and layering objects in your paintings can help create a sense of depth. With this technique, smaller, further away objects in the background are placed behind larger objects in the foreground. This makes them feel like they are a greater distance away from the viewer. Even in a shallow space, this effect still works. Detail and size. The size of your object or subjects can heavily contribute to the illusion of depth in your drawing or painting. Smaller objects with less detail are perceived as being further away. The smaller an object is, the further away it is perceived to be. Distant objects are also lighter and have less detail than nearer objects, which are more saturated and detailed. Value and contrast. As mentioned earlier, the way you can model and render your forms can contribute to a feeling of depth by showing your viewer where your light source is. Dark and warm colors will also seem much closer than lighter colors and cool colors, which are used to enhance the perception of distance in a work of art. Chiaroscuro is a form of heavily directed lighting as shown in the image here. The value contrast it provides indicates where the light source is, but also defines the space by depicting where and how the shadows fall. With these techniques and tools of observation, you should have the ability to render three-dimensional objects in a two-dimensional space. Mostly what beginners in painting should focus on is observation over all else. Ultimately, these are just tools to add to your skill set. This concludes Module 3.1. Please continue to Module 3.2. The unvoiced PowerPoints will be available on Canvas for review if needed.